Okay, I think we're live, everyone. So let's get started since we're running a little bit late. Hi, my name is Shania. I'm going to be the moderator today for what happens after your startup gets acquired. And since we're running a little short on time, I'd love to have each one of our panelists take 30 seconds to introduce themselves, let everybody know what the company they had acquired is and what they're doing now.
Great. So I'm Claire Vo. I am currently the VP of Product at Optimizely, and I was the CEO and co-founder of a company called Experiment Engine that was acquired a year and 1 day ago by Optimizely. We at Experiment Engine built solutions for enterprise customers to scale and manage their experimentation programs, and that has been recently, as of January, re-released as part of the Optimizely platform as Optimizely Program Management, which top enterprises use to collaborate, manage, and report on their high-velocity experimentation programs.
Awesome. Thanks, Claire. Next.
Hi, I'm Selena Tabakwala. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Gixo. We do live coach fitness classes right from your phone. In terms of previous startups, I had started Evite with actually the same co-founder from Gixo about 2 decades ago. So the only reason you don't see gray hair is because it's been dyed. But we got acquired by Interactive Corp. And then on the other side of the table, I was at Ticketmaster and did about 10 acquisitions and was the president and CTO at SurveyMonkey and also did a number of acquisitions there. So I have experiences on both sides of the table.
Awesome.
So my name is Sarah Allen. The first company I co-founded was straight out of school, was the Company of Science and Art, which was acquired, created After Effects. It was acquired by Aldis in '93, and subsequently by Adobe in '94. And then more recently, I founded Blazing Cloud, which was a consultancy founded in 2009 and acqui-hired by Indiegogo in 2013. So the team joined Indiegogo. I'm now at Google as an engineering manager, leading some teams doing serverless events for serverless compute and security policy.
Awesome. And I guess I should probably go too. I am currently today I'm a senior technical product manager at eBay. And before that, I was a product manager at Google. And I started a digital marketing agency doing digital marketing and web development for women entrepreneurs, experts, and authors that I sold my half of the company to a different partner. So I'm happy to be here and we can jump right in. So I'd love to quickly go over the types of acquisitions. So what are kind of the buckets in which an acquisition could fall on or why you would like to get acquired? Let's take that.
Sure. Did you want one of us to start or?
Yes.
Okay, sure. I can kind of walk through in terms of, so, there's different reasons, especially as an acquiring company, why you might want to acquire a company. I mean, the first is an acqui-hire where you really want to get the talent, and that's one type of acquisition. The second is when it's what's called accretive, which is where either the revenue is growing faster, or the user growth is growing faster than the core company. And so that's where you essentially are buying it for the financial or business value. And a third situation is really if it's like a strategic option for a product area or product advancement that you want to essentially go do, which is, you're a sort of, small business and now you're bringing somebody in who's giving you enterprise experience, or there's different sort of strategic tie-ins or fit-ins. And those will generally be the main sort of philosophies around acquisitions.
Awesome. That's great. So what I'd love to do is if anyone on the line has any questions, feel free to put them in and we can have about 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. But I'm going to starting from pre-acquisition. So there's people on the line that are in different stages of their careers and founding of their companies. So what are some of the ways that you can be prepared to be acquired before you're ready? What are some of the things that entrepreneurs on the line should be thinking about before they ever start to get acquired? How about Claire, you take this one?
Yeah, so I think somebody asked me that question a while ago, like, what should you do if you want to sell your company? And I was like, if you want to sell your company, you're not in a great place to sell your company. So almost if you are preparing to be acquired before you're quote unquote ready, you're probably not focused on the right things. So what I would say is the best preparation for an acquisition is a highly functional, value generating company. And so the thing that you should do is try to maximize the value of your business by focusing on customers, growing revenue, reducing friction in whatever marketing or sales funnels you have, and ultimately building a valuable asset that somebody would want to acquire. I think the things that lead to a good business are going to lead to healthy acquisitions. And so I don't recommend you do anything special if you're not intending to be acquired or aren't ready to be acquired that you wouldn't already do to make your business valuable.
Good answer.
I would absolutely plus one that, with kind of the one exception being trying to really make sure that way before you get acquired, you have a conversation with your co-founder, if you have any, about what is either that number or what is that situation that you want to be acquired, because it's very different, like in the heat of the moment when people are coming to you, and really making sure that you have sort of that baseline understanding with your founders of like, are we trying to build this into a multi-billion-dollar company? Like if we get an offer for somebody comes in tomorrow for $100 million, like would we take it, or is it $15 million? And having that conversation up front, because what you don't want to do is if somebody approaches you, be on a very different pages with your founding team.
Yeah, I was going to chime in. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. We can hear you.
I was going to chime in on that too. I think that people who are founding their company for the first time don't necessarily think through all the different things that might happen. And while you might be starting to be an independent company that IPOs, having a frank conversation with your co-founders, it's like, well, what if it's year 5 and we expected to have this big outcome in year 3? How are we going to feel about it? How are we going to value what we're doing? How will we handle that situation together? Because, that having that pre-conversation, like you mentioned, is where you can have like a really healthy discourse around that, rather than waiting until your co-founder is burned out and they're ready to quit, and then you're stuck with a company that is like maybe on the verge of profitability, but not doing everything you want. You want to like be doing it together. And of course, the best way to get sold or the best way to go into any of these situations is to be in a great situation. But sometimes, just to be honest, people sell their companies when things aren't going so well.
Awesome. Those are really, really great answers. Thanks. So I love, since we're kind of in this pre-acquisition conversation, I would love to take the flip side of this. So what does the acquiring company look for that entrepreneurs today should be aware of? So if I'm a company and I want to acquire another company, what are some of those things? What are they looking for? What are some of the big ticket items that an entrepreneur should be building for?
I think they're reflected in the types of acquisitions that were described at the beginning of this session, which is essentially like, will acquiring this company net us ROI positive in terms of revenue? Will it add strategic value to my product portfolio or my company portfolio? Or does it add talent that's otherwise difficult or expensive to acquire and retain? I think those are pretty simple. Like they're looking for money, they're looking for a strategic advantage, and they're looking for talent. It's actually like, there's no like secret sauce thing a company's looking for other than to like generate value for shareholders. And so those are the 3 things that can do that most directly.
Well, I think there is another nuance to it. What you say is absolutely correct. The other thing is they're looking for a company that's going to be successful in bringing that value to the new entity. And so one of the things that you should know, like both sides need to know, is like, what's the culture of the company that's being acquired? Is it where the bigger company wants to go, or is it substantially different in a way that the acquired team is going to have to adapt? And that's something where like nobody acquires a company because they think it's going to not go well. Yet a lot of times the goals of the acquisition aren't met, right? or it doesn't quite live up to its hopes. And I've, sort of been in bigger companies where teams have been acquired and then their product gets canceled when that wasn't really the goal. Sometimes that is expected. And just matching expectations up front. And if you are bringing your culture to the company and they're really excited about that, how are you going to infuse the company in that culture, with that culture? Or if your culture is very like, we're a little tiny startup and we're excited about that, how are you going to survive in this giant company? How are you going to make that a positive experience for the company and for your team? And so I think that they're looking for like, how is this going to transition into a success?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So I think it's actually a segue into kind of conflicts of acquisitions and some of the challenges that can come with, after you've been acquired and the actual negotiation process. So I'd like to dig a little bit more into that. So let's say that I receive an offer for an acquisition. And what are some of the basic kind of negotiation tactics when you're negotiating an acquisition if you are the starting founder?
I can chime in there. By the time you receive, I haven't had a ton. I mean, I don't know. Some people have had like 8 companies acquired. Like I have from my data points and from the people that I know, like by the time you receive an offer, you've pretty much already negotiated everything. Like that's not where you start negotiating. On your first meeting with the acquiring company is the beginning of the negotiation. And so what I found is that was really a discovery process in when I was looking at having Blazing Cloud acquired. There were way more things that were negotiable than I ever thought to negotiate. And I really learned that because we were approached by a company, which then sort of triggered me to think about, like, is this the company we want to be acquired by? And, and then by talking to a number of different companies, I realized how different the situations were for my team. And then I was like, oh, well, maybe this other company would offer this, thing. And I had to really think about, does the team want to stay together? Are they like super happy just joining the new company as like individuals? So this was what they call an acqui-hire. So it was really just the team transitioning into a bigger company. And so I think that there's all sorts of value that the company can give to you and that your team can bring to the company that aren't dollars and shares.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any tips on negotiation?
Yeah, I think, this was said a little bit before on you need to get alignment with your co-founder on, what would be the outcomes or the situations in which you consider an acquisition. I think you also need to have as a leadership team, whether you're a co-founder or as part of your board or whatever that is, your priorities in terms of the things you negotiate. Like you can't negotiate to every end on everything and get like the perfect deal done. So you really have to stack order what's important to you. Is it the financial outcomes? Is it the outcomes for the team? Is it the structure of the deal? Is it the title that you're coming in on? Is it, what happens to your product? There's a whole bunch of things that aren't just dollars, and you really need to prioritize kind of your give to gets, right? Like if I can get the financial thing, like I'm okay taking a lower title or my team being broke up or whatever those things are. And if you have clarity on it, it makes the negotiation a lot easier.
I think there's also similarly aligning those things in terms of with why you're being acquired and what the company is actually looking for. So, if you're negotiating on financials as an example, there's a question of how much of your financial liquidity will you take now and how much are you willing to take depending upon certain or specific targets, and that's an interesting way to sometimes also look at structure.
Is Selena frozen?
That's good to me.
Oh, there you are. Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, you froze for me. But everyone heard her, right? Yes. Okay. Okay, good.
Sorry about
that. So one of the things that a few of you have mentioned is managing employee expectations. You mentioned your teams. You mentioned the other people kind of involved in the company. Does anyone want to talk about managing the expectations of your team and your employees through an acquisition? If some people are excited about the acquisition and some people are not?
I'll speak to that first. I think that it's like, if particularly in my most recent situation in acquihire, like the team's the whole thing, right? And so if like knowing going into it that these 2 people out of these 12 are just not into it, then be really, like in our case, we were just super open about it. Like, okay, they're not going. And then in one case, I had a somebody who was on my leadership team who was very skeptical about the acquisition. Yeah, just in general, she was like, I don't know if I want to do this thing. And so then I was just upfront with the people we were talking to. I was like, well, depending on what type of a situation you provide, you may or may not get my whole leadership team. And I think that with a small team, I'd be interested in people who might have had bigger teams. Being open about it was really good. The other thing is often with an acquisition these days, this didn't used to be true like in the early 90s, but now they want to interview all the engineers. And that's kind of a weird thing, interviewing for your own job. But we ended up doing that together. Like we did practice interviews together, and then we went and interviewed at a bunch of different companies together. And it was like this real bonding thing, which was kind of fun and unexpected. So like whenever you can, have fun with it, because it's incredible. The uncertainty of an acquisition is incredibly stressful to your folks because they're not in a decision-making position. And it's incredibly stressful for you. But if you're negotiating and you have the power and you're the final decision maker, or at least on the decision-making team, it's a whole different situation. So think about ways that you can make it good for them and fun for them, and make it clear, if it's true, that that you're taking their situation into account.
I'll add a alternate point of view, which is I took full on mama bear, like protectionist mode when we did our acquisition, and essentially shielded the entire team from the acquisition process, because ultimately we needed to build a valuable business either way. And I saw the potential for the acquisition to be just kind of like a 0.1% thing that this was going to, like, we're going to negotiate to something that we liked. And even if we did, we're like going to get through all the legal stuff. And then we get to the legal stuff, we get to the employment stuff, and then we sign a deal and like it all happens and it's happy. You can ask my team up until the point the acquisition happened. I was like, there's a 0.5% chance like this is going to happen. So let's act as business as normal. Mm-hmm. And part of that was exactly what you said. I didn't want my team interviewed for jobs that they already had. I went to the leadership team of the company that acquired my team, and I said, I have credibility. You can interview me all day and night, but I hired a great team that built a great product. And if you don't trust me that they can add value to our team, like that's a big problem for me. So I actually took a more proactive stance in terms of isolating the team from the acquisition, because it was so distracting at the scale we were at that I didn't see necessarily upside. And I think you would talk to my team and they would say that I very much protected their personal and employment interests in that thing. So I didn't put them in situations that were bad. But I also didn't bring that like stress and uncertainty into our business that we were still running day to day.
And I think there's various scenarios. Like there's one scenario, which is the acquihire scenario, where as an acquiring company, if you're acquiring the talent, that's what you're buying, and you want to actually interview the talent. And so you have to bring your employees along. But at that point, presumably you've been transparent with the team of like why you're in an acquihire situation. And then there's like the strategic sort of product, like where you're helping us enter a new space. And in those acquisition scenarios, normally you can keep the team fairly intact. But the difficult part in those scenarios is like, you have to figure out if your culture that you've been building as a company is aligned to this culture of the acquiring company, because, you know, you have to expect there's going to be a certain amount of turnover in your own employee base after you get acquired, if there's a culture mismatch with the parent company, essentially. And then there's a third scenario where it's like, you know, they're buying your revenue and you're potentially your customer base. And often in those scenarios, you know, there is a document which shows synergies between the two companies, which essentially means cutting of staff. And so, you know, you have to understand, when you're the CEO and the founder of the company, you know, what is that sort of intention of the company you're acquiring? And in the third scenario, how are you protecting the downside of people that are going to get get made redundant or let go or whatever, because there is that scenario. Well, and as Claire said, how can you elevate that in the negotiation conversation at the beginning if that's important to you, in terms of your gives and your gets. And so, I mean, it really depends on the type of acquisition in terms of what the team is gonna happen. But I don't think that I've seen very few acquisitions where 12, 24 months on, especially, often retention packages are 12 to 24 months on, you don't see a certain amount of turnover from the team that has been acquired. And so, I mean, because there will be change. And I think being able to be honest with your team, saying there is going to be change after an acquisition. There's no way it can stay exactly the same. You can do your best to keep a lot the same, but it is impossible to keep everything the same.
Awesome. So I think we talked a lot about post-acquisition, so I'd like to get to that in a minute. But how do you juggle multiple opportunities, and when do you know to turn down an acquisition? Like, what are some of those red flags?
So, I mean, I think one of the biggest red flags is if you don't, I mean, again, is a little bit of that culture, which is like, if you want to, there's always the pure financial outcome where it's like, where people are going to get their financials, and maybe that's all that matters in this scenario. But if you're trying to have your product live on, and or you're trying to have your essentially the employee side, I think it is important to understand what is the incentive of the acquiring company, and and are we aligned to that strategy? Is that strategy something that we actually want to do? And so I do think that a red flag from your perspective is if you don't feel like that you're able to get that openness with the acquiring company. And that's true. Like, if you think of it as like a new job, as if you're interviewing for a new manager, because that's essentially what you're doing. Like, you need to make sure there's mission alignment, cultural alignment, and transparency. And it's doing backdoor references on that acquiring company is your responsibility as the CEO.
Yeah, I think that value and goal alignment is really important, and I'm glad you mentioned the sort of backdoor references, because you want to get a sense of, is this going to be successful, right? And if you get indicators that they're not being genuine with you, that they're not being upfront, which could be unintentional, right? It could be a mismatch of how you communicate or any number of things. Then, especially if you're anticipating that there's a, sort of a payout, usually, like there's like, okay, after a year, you get this, in 2 years and 3 years. If you're not going to be able to hit those milestones, then just walk, because it's just not worth it.
And some people are good to talk to are previous founders who have been acquired by that organization.
Awesome. Claire, did you have
the investors of previous founders who've been
We were lucky we shared investors with our acquiring company, so we had a good inside track.
Yeah, that helps. Yeah, and I think that's worth mentioning. So with Blazing Cloud, I never took any money because I didn't want to be beholden to investors. And then I realized when we were, because I didn't know that you could actually get acquired as a consulting company. It never even crossed my mind that was an option. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, it's a thing. And so I talked to a lot of other people who've been acquired and gone through these acqui-hire things. And then I discovered that for many of them, their investors did the negotiation and knew the people on the other side of the table. And then I was like, wow, I'd love somebody to do this for me. So, I mean, there's two sides of that, because sometimes the investors have things that are goals that are different than yours. But it's just, I hadn't really thought through how positive it can be to have an investor in going through changes in your company.
Awesome. So we're starting to get some questions in, and we will take those in a few more minutes. So if you have any more questions, please put them in the Ask a Question. I'd like to get into the post-acquisition. One thing that we really want to think about is, what was that transition like for each of you from CEO to now employee of a large corporation or mid-sized corporation? What was kind of the best thing about that, and then the worst thing about that?
So I can start. The transition was super easy. Like I've worked at companies of all size, and I was never a CEO that started a company because I didn't want a boss. Like that wasn't my motivation. And I used to joke that I took venture capital, so I had bosses, and they were a little bit more intense than the ones I had at the corporate jobs that I had. So the actual transition back to the quote unquote corporate world was very easy for me. I'm very comfortable in at scale companies, and I think my background added a lot of value immediately to the company in terms of management strategy and operations and things that we needed at the size of the company that we're at now. So my personal transition was easy. I think the hardest part has been emotionally letting go of my product. I mean, my product is integrated into our ecosystem. It's part of the platform. I have a product manager that works on my team that runs my product. And I still have that CEO like, oh, we should, and like, I actually had to pull him aside in a meeting the other day and be like, look, I love this thing, but this is your baby now. And you do what's right with it from a product perspective. And I'll be super excited about it, but ultimately it's yours to own. And so you really do have to let go, especially if you're brought in to take in a much broader role across the organization and not just like baby your product for years and years on end at the expense of the overall success of the company.
And I'd say for me, it was such a long time ago when I was first acquired as being, but I was kind of in the opposite situation where I'd never seen a company at scale. I was a first time founder. And then that was my first job right out of college, was doing Evite. And so it was a big transition for me to suddenly like be in a company, and even things like, little things, but it was like expense reports or doing, big PowerPoint decks, and stuff like that I had never really had experience in. And so it was a pretty big transition. And the biggest thing that was supportive to me was I was in the acquiring company. That's what I was saying, is the person who became my boss was an amazing mentor to me. His name's Sean Moriarty, and he's now the CEO of Leaf Group. But that was a really important thing for me because I didn't, unlike Claire, like I wasn't walking in with experience. And so I do think if you're a founder and it's your first startup and you really haven't kind of where, that is I was 24 years old, I think, when we got acquired. And so I think who is going to be that manager and how are they going to be able to help guide you through is pretty important, depending upon where you are in your career cycle.
Yeah, I think when my first startup was acquired, COSA was acquired by Aldis. We were all like in our early 20s. And we were, and I think building those alliances, like Enrique Goodrow did managed the acquisition from the Aldis side, and he remains a friend to this day. And he just helped us navigate this like corporate world. And I think the one thing that is a kind of a counterpoint to what Claire was saying is that sometimes your domain better than the acquiring company. Like in that case, they really acquired After Effects so that was going to be the cornerstone of their digital media group. And then less than a year later, all this was acquired by Adobe, which had Premiere. And so they stacked up the products that had some redundancy between Adobe and all this, because there was like Freehand and Illustrator, like these different but mostly it was complementary. And they looked at After Effects and Premiere and they said, okay, we're going to have to cancel After Effects. And so the team did, it was our product managers, but we all participated in it, like really sketching out that the video space was broader and educating them that there's, post-production, production and special effects. And there are these different parts of the market. And then there were like some other products that we put into this like 2x2 matrix. And so to really focus on what is like your little company is like no longer a thing. You are doing what's best for this big entity. And sometimes you have to let go, and sometimes you have to hold on to what's right because you understand this. You are acquired because you understand this sort of world, some part of the world better than the acquiring company. And you have to explain that.
Awesome. So I'd like to talk, that's a really great segue into like getting into like post-acquisition. So like after you've been acquired, like how do you foster like inclusion and retain your culture of being a smaller startup inside this larger company? And, or like, what are some of the things that you're thinking about when you're trying to merge with a new culture?
So this is a really tactical thing. Just make sure that you have culture-specific emojis set up in Slack. So we're from Texas. So the first things that got set up were like our old logo, the Texas flag, the hook 'em horns because I'm a Longhorn, and a taco emoji. So like immediately we infused the communications culture at Optimizely with very important cultural touchstones.
Awesome.
But I think part of that is like, what can, you don't have to drink the Kool-Aid. You don't have to come in and say, we have to do everything the way that you've always done. Like you're bringing a really special team into a company. And in that first year in particular, you're at a point where people celebrate that and they want to be excited about it. And they want to know what your team brings to the office. And so just kind of introducing the personality of your team, introducing the personality of the people on your team, and really giving company-wide platforms for displaying that so it can be infused across the entire organization, I found that has just fostered a lot of friendships, fostered a lot of excitement around the acquisition that has made the product and team much more successful. So it sounds really simple, but I do think, what are those lists of like inside jokes and priorities that you had at your old startup? Like bring those in and show those to people because that's a fun part of your team too.
Yeah, I think having rituals, right? Like, so my startups were acquired before Slack. Was a thing. Like with After Effects, like I think because we were just maybe we were a little naive, maybe we were insulated. I don't remember there being a lot of challenges to how we did things, and we just kept doing the things that we were doing. And we had a very strong beta group where we had very good relationships with the post houses that used our software. And we continued to have that kind of community that spanned our customers and our team throughout like basically two big mergers. And I think, and I've seen that with, I now work at Google, work with a team that was Firebase, and they were acquired, and they have like team lunches every Wednesday and Friday that they had before Google and they have after Google, and they have certain things that they do that they've always done, and they adjusted things a little bit, but then they just kept doing the things that make them who they are, that aren't like, none of these kinds of things are like, oh yeah, that's my company doesn't do that. But you'll hear that, right? Like, sometimes you'll be in a big company and they'll be like, oh yeah, but we don't do that here. And I think that you want to, in a nice way, like not say, no, we are going to do something completely different from what you're asking me to do, but practice the like, yes, and like the great idea, I'm going to interpret it this way. And then I also want to acknowledge that like with Blazing Cloud, I didn't go with the acquisition. And that was like, I didn't even realize one could do that, but it turned out one can. And so that's, just, all the things don't have to be the way that, you might hear about them being done.
Yeah, and I want to kind of just rip off one thing that you said, which is also as the leader, the founder, the CEO, whatever coming in, you have to be a leader for things that are going to change. Like you have to be the person that says, yeah, I know we used to do that way and it was super easy and fast and chill. And now there's a 4-step process and that's life. And, you have to know your movable objects. And I think as kind of the leader, the team, whether they get dispersed to different departments or report to you or not, are going to look to you to set the tone. And so you have to be clear about the things that are going to change and the things that aren't going to change. Keep your rituals that are really powerful and important, but also, say when something's not serving us anymore in this new context, we need to let it go and move on to bigger and better things.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So we have about 13 minutes left and there's about 4 questions. So for managers at acquiring companies, how can they support the trend? Can you hear me?
Now I think you were asking as a manager how you can support the acquisition.
Yeah, for managers at acquiring companies, how can they support the transition or what should they not do?
So I think that, exactly what Clara was saying, which is, making sure that that you have that open communication with the leader of the team, of the person who you've acquired, and making sure you're collecting feedback from them often, so that if there are things that are minor that are important to people, you can help make those changes. So whether that's you hear that story of Jet and Walmart, where like Jet had happy hours and Walmart said, we don't do alcohol. And the Jet leader said, well, we're going to keep doing happy hours, and it's an important part of our culture. And so it's like, which are those things that are important enough to the leader that on the organization, that when they're pushing back on you, you can really take that and try to make the change. And which are the things you have to say is, hey, look, we're not going to be able to change on this issue, and here's why. Like, here's the thing that is important. And, I think the other thing is like, people during an acquisition, it is a big change for them. And so the more you can like communicate about, here's our company, here's our culture, here's how we plan to operate things, but we're open to feedback, we're open to change. Obviously, I'm a little biased having spent so many years at SurveyMonkey, but it's, collecting that feedback, whether through surveys or through talking to people, but sort of making sure that you're keeping that sort of employee engagement, understanding of the company that you've acquired, I think is extremely important, because if you don't get those employees engaged, and at least for 12 to 24 months, the integration into your platform is nearly impossible.
Yeah. I would say continually evaluate your talent that you brought in from an acquisition on a regular and frequent basis, because even if you go through, let's say, a formal interview process, you just don't know until people land into the acquisition and start performing how they're going to do. I've been really proud that every team member that we brought into the acquisition has been, done really, really well, and has been super successful. No one's quit. Some people have been promoted. But the company, the acquiring company, took the time and effort to continually evaluate performance and say, wow, we really underestimated you because we didn't have tons of visibility into what you're doing. But now that you're here, you're a total rock star. Really helped keep employees engaged, which meant that we got the product integrated very quickly, which means that we got in the hands of customers and started driving value. So I don't think there are very few things that are as expensive from a time and money perspective as a failed acquisition. Right. So it's worth the investment to continue to make sure that that's successful.
And I think added to that is that making sure that what the integration plan and strategy is very clear and laid out very quickly. So you've had a lot of time with the company to start having the conversation, because in most cases, the team is unaware of the acquisition until it happens. And so, making sure that you're not just talking about the deal, but that you're strategically aligned with what are you going to do with that product after, so that within a 60 or 90-day window, you can very quickly come out with what is the integration plan from a product and technology and sales team, all of that perspective. The quicker you can show people what your integration plan and strategy is, the better off it's going to be. And that plan could say for 12 months, we're going to do nothing, but at least coming up with a clear communication plan.
Yeah, I think both those points, all those points are really great. I think also from the technical side, especially these days, it's really important. The tech stacks are never the same, right? And usually the big co has something which is horrible from a startup founder perspective, and sometimes they love it over there, or sometimes they acknowledge that it's horrible, and that's just how we don't have time to fix it. We need to integrate your stuff. And sometimes they have some super awesome thing that you would never find if you're not in the know. So I think it's really important for acquisitions that involve engineers to find key senior engineers and make in the acquiring company and make them responsible for the success of the acquisition, and partner them with individual senior talent so they can learn from each other, and really position it, if you can, in a collaborative way, because that knowledge transfer of is so important. And it is, these days, it is just, I've seen a lot of friends go through this and companies go through this in all different big corps. And it's just a little culture shock. Oh, I used to just deploy, 5 times a day from my machine. And now there's this process, and I have to maybe I have to use a different language. Maybe they're using 3 versions ago thing that they can't upgrade until 2020. And you're what? And it's that's very hard on engineers. And so there has to be the social, like the professional social connections where they can kind of hack the system together.
Awesome. So any one of you have any regrets or things that you would do differently if you could do your acquisition over again?
I would have mama beared slightly less and let my team be interviewed, because some of them were, I think, undervalued at the point of acquisition, and they were very quickly corrected, and we could have skipped that whole cycle if I had just not been like, my team, back off. And so I think that's one thing that I would have managed slightly differently. I still liked insulating the team, but I think I probably could have done it in a more effective way.
I think I would have more proactively assessed, like had more confidence myself in my understanding what the other company needed. In some cases I was just like, I deferred to them, like, oh, you want XYZ and don't want ABC. Okay, let's work with that, right? And took that as a fact, instead of realizing that I actually really understood their business. And there were things that happened after the fact that I was like, oh, I was right. And I should have taken the time to really talk through that with them and present more of my ideas of how this could play out. I mean, it was for a good outcome from my perspective, but there was details where I was like, oh, kind of missed opportunity there.
I would say from my perspective, it wasn't necessarily the regret of the acquisition, but is what led you to get acquired. So in the sense of, we took for Evite far too much capital and so it put us in a position where to get the investor return, meant we had to essentially make a revenue base that was so high that the better path for us was acquisition. So I think there's this question of like, why would you ever get acquired? Why wouldn't you just build your business to be great? And those are like various different instances. Like one is because it's actually the best financial outcome for your investors and yourselves. Like another is because you see that when you look at the strategic window, you actually see that this may be a better home to be part of that larger organization or larger strategic approach versus just trying to go at it your own. So I don't think we have regrets around the acquisition. I think when you looked at, especially for us, Evite is one of the few platforms that is still around from that era of the .com bust.
You actually answered one of the questions that was already in our queue, which was why would a startup want to be acquired as opposed to company. So thanks for that. And I think we have time for one more question. So from the employee perspective, if they don't want to be a part of an acquisition or an acqui-hire, at what stage would you, the founder or CEO, would like them to voice their opinion? Would it be better for them to just leave as soon as they realize you're heading in a direction that they don't want to go? Would you rather them wait until they see a little bit? What's your kind of perspective on that?
Well, no one's ever going to force you to take a job. Like no one can put a gun to your head and force you to take a job. So you're never stuck. So I think my advice is know your priority. I mean, we've said this multiple times, know your priorities as a CEO, know your priorities as a company, know your priorities as an employee. And if you're going into an early stage startup that has, particularly one that may have taken capital, being acqui-hired is an option, and you need to be straight with your leadership team that hey, I'm in it, I love early stage, but if we go down the path of an acqui-hire, I just might not be part of it. I think that's really fair. I don't think you're ever going to be contractually stuck in an employment situation you don't want to be in. So I think the risk there is fairly low to just kind of see what your options are and play it out as you want.
And I think there's also, there's not much risk either to, especially if you've never been in a situation like that is scaled, is to see if you like it. There's oftentimes you go into that situation and, when I got acquired, my father told me, he said, do it for a year and then make a decision if you like being at a scaled company or a startup company. I mean, you've never seen the other side. And in the end, I learned a ton from being in that type of environment. Eventually, obviously, I've gone to start something from scratch again and love that more. But, I think you don't know what you're going to learn. So it's hard to take that position really strong up front. I would just say try to think about the flexibility around it.
I think that's a really good point. I think as a manager and a CEO, I always appreciate it when my employees were up front. But I love that this perspective of like, go on, go for the ride, right? Like, I feel like in my career, I've had the opportunity to like Silicon Valley tech tourism. Like, like if you haven't been through an acquisition, like you missed out on something really kind of interesting, even if it's horrible. Like the stories are incredible that you like can't tell publicly, but over drinks. Like it makes you a stronger person to understand both sides and to understand how the industry works. So, and you're always, even as an individual contributor, you're exposed to this business side that normally you don't get to see as an individual contributor. So yeah, I think that I would encourage everybody to go along for the ride and to just, take a deep breath and experience it, right? And give it time, like give it not infinite time. Like don't check out and say like, this is sucky, but just be in it, but don't get caught up in it because it'll change every 3 months. And, I like the idea of riding it out for a year and see what happens. You can always quit.
And rarely do people get paid less. Like, I've never really seen that happen where people are like, oh man, I did this acqui-hire and I'm making way less and everything's like, it's not usually what happens.
Yeah, I've never seen that happen either. So there's a little upside down no matter what.
Yeah.
So in our final minute, what is the one last piece of advice you'd like to give all of our entrepreneurs on the line?
I think that from my perspective, I was just going to say from my perspective, don't build your business ever for acquisition. Just try to focus on building a big business that has good financial, structure and pillars. And then, and then acquisition may be a possibility in front of you, but don't walk in thinking about that as kind of the goal.
Okay, I regret letting you go first because you stole mine, which is like, don't build your company looking to be acquired. Like, don't go seeking an acquisition. Build something awesome, and an exit will come. But like, that's not really a thing you can engineer. You can only engineer a great company. So that's what I would focus on.
Yeah, I think I agree with those things. I ran a consulting company knowing that I wouldn't do it forever. And I was sort of a happy exit of like, oh, wow, I can get acquired. Great. But I think build relationships with people at other companies, right? So your partners, the people who buy your software, the people like knowing other CEOs, whether they're a company you're doing business with or just a peer company, will teach you so many things you didn't even need to know. You didn't know you needed to know. And then having those relationships, if suddenly you're put in a situation where somebody makes you an offer and you didn't expect it, you didn't plan for it, having those relationships built already so you can talk to friends who've been in the situation before is invaluable.
Awesome. Well, I think we're all done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. I'm sure we've all learned so much from all of you ladies and valuable experiences.
Thanks, ladies. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.